Good afternoon, and welcome to the Italian Culture Institute virtually. Thank you for attending this webinar. Now, every year on January 27, Italy commemorates the Giorno della Memoria, or the Day of Remembrance, which is a very symbolic and important date because on January 27, 1945, it was the date that marks basically the discovery of Auschwitz. It's when the date when the Russian army opened the gates and discovered the horrors of the concentration camp. So every year, Italy commemorates this event, both nationally and internationally, with a series of events in Italy and abroad through the network of the Italian embassies, consulates, and Italian cultural institutes. So here in Toronto, we have the honor and the pleasure to have two esteemed experts on the subjects and to study their work in the field of Judaism and history, so that they will be in discussion, and then the session will also be opened at the end for questions and answers from all of you. And thank you for participating. I would like then to introduce our speakers, starting from Dr. Simonetta Della Seta. Simonetta was a former director. She was director of the National Museum of Judaism and the Shoah in Ferrara from 2016 to 2020. She is also a member, a delegate for the Italian delegate, actually, for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. She was director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Tel Aviv for many years. She was advisor to the Italian embassy on Judaism and also in Tel Aviv for many, many years. She collaborates regularly with the Yad Vashem in Israel. She has also been she has received the high commendation, which is in Italian is the l'Ordine della Stella d'Italia, from the Italian President of the Republic, Giorgio Napolitano, in 2007. She writes extensively. She is a research and historian, and we're really, really glad to have her here with us today. She is online from Italy. Thank you for accepting, notwithstanding the time difference. Our second speaker, and they'll be in conversation, is Dr. Jeremy Maron. Jeremy is the curator, content of the Holocaust and Genocide section at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. He has been with the museum since 2011, and he is also his curator of the 3 permanent galleries, and was also curator of Points of View, a national human rights photographic exhibition in 2017. He holds a PhD in cultural mediations from Carleton University. He's also has published a number of journals, and most recently in Cine Action on the films of Canadian Holocaust survivor Jack Cooper. Thank you very much. I would like to start this webinar by passing, so to speak, the microphone to Dr. Simonetta Della Seta. Simonetta, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really glad, and I would like to send my warmest regards to all my friends connected, especially from Toronto. And I would like to dedicate my conversation to somebody whom I called my Toronto sister, Dina Freeman. So I'm here today, and again, I think I would like, first of all, to speak about what is this date in Italy and what is the influence on the existence of different museums. So I will actually share something with you. So give me just a minute. But before then, let's remember together that the law that issued the Day of Remembrance was issued exactly 20 years ago. So after that, after this law, Italy discussed how to have a place in order to speak about remembrance and speak about the Holocaust. You know, Italy had always a very small community, especially compared to the Canadian one, a small Jewish community, but a very old Jewish community. Is 2,000 years of presence of the Jews in the Italian territory with no interruption. So this is why the National Museum is called the National Museum of Italian Judaism or Jewry and the Holocaust, because it's extremely important not only to remember the chapter, the terrible chapter of the Holocaust, but to put this and to give life to this and to tell more about Jewish history, Jewish values, Jewish culture, and Jewish life in Italy. So I actually, you know, this museum was created under my direction, was open in 2017, and we had the honor to have the president of the Italian Republic. So you see, this is the museum is not yet completed. You will see that this is only the beginning, but you see that it's hosting people all the time. It's very liveful, and as all the students are coming, of course not now with the pandemic, but it has become quite a center of culture, a center of education, a center of discussion, and I would say a real hub. So this is the museum in Simon. Why do I show you part of this museum? Because, you know, without showing the history, and here we are in front of the bassorilievo that you have under the Arch of Titus in Rome. And this is where you can see, you know, these are the Romans taking the treasure from the temple in Jerusalem, 70 after the Vulgar era. So the Jews were already in Rome. Actually, they were in Rome 200 before the Christ. So, you know, when you put this into context, you realize only then you can speak about the Holocaust. And the maze, this is the name of the museum, has now a huge part also on the Holocaust. You see, this is a very, very impressive installation by Israeli architect Danny Caravan, showing actually the miles between Ferrara. Ferrara is a city in Italy about an hour south from Venice. So this is the distance between Ferrara and Auschwitz. And again, this is the part of the museum dedicated to the Holocaust, especially dedicated to the beginning of the Holocaust in Italy with the anti-Jewish laws issued by Mussolini in 1938. This is when the discrimination against the Jews started strongly in Italy, and the Jews who were there since the Roman era suddenly became not any longer normal citizen. And this is the Italian story of, and the Italian Shoah, the Italian Holocaust. So you see, you know, the museum is showing a lot of this story with all the technology. Since I want to be brief, because I want to dialogue with Jeremy, I want to show you how the museum is going to look in 2 or 3 years. So it's a huge compound, very, very big compound with a park and with 7 buildings. So this is the look of the museum, hopefully in 2 or 3 years. But the Mace is not the only museum in Italy dedicated to the history of the Jews and especially to the Holocaust. Here we are in Milan. This is the Shoah Memorial in Milan. And this is a special place because it's a unique site and it's a real, true site. This is the part of the train station in Milan from where the Jews of the northern Italy were deported to Auschwitz. It's underground and you hear the noise of the trains on top. And this is exactly the place from which the Jews were deported. It's important, you see that it's today, they kept it the same way it was. Of course, they renovated. And it's important to let you know that exactly tomorrow, they will start a virtual tour of this museum. At the end, you will get all the websites of these museums. So this is a real site and has become a place where a lot of students and teachers and people are coming to understand what happened to the Jews of Italy. And you see the website, the Milan Shoah Memorial, you have a guide. But here we are in Rome. You see the difference. This is the heart of the Roman Jewish quarter, where once there was a ghetto and the Roman Jews were closed in a ghetto from 1555 to the unity of Italy in 1870. So many, many years, decades. And in this ghetto, in this building, there is the Shoah, is actually the first house of the Holocaust Museum of Rome. So Mace is a national museum and Mace is based on a national law and is completely financed by the government of Italy. The Holocaust Museum in Rome, in the ghetto of Rome, is financed by the municipality of Rome and the region around Rome. But this is not the way it will look in a few years. Well, now it hosts all kinds of exhibitions, but this is the way it will look soon. They are building in Rome, and the architects Luca Zevi and Giorgio Tamburini in Villa Torlonia, which, by the way, was the headquarters of Mussolini, and they're building an Holocaust museum. I'll show you, it's in the middle of the villa, and this is the way it will look. But Italy doesn't have only museums. We are here near Modena in the concentration camp of Fossoli. It's important to show this camp because not so many people know that the Jews of Italy were deported into an Italian camp from which the trains were organized not only by the Nazis, but before by the fascists. So Holocaust history in Italy is not only due to Nazi occupation. That was, of course, the most critical time of the deportation, especially the deportation of the Jews of Rome, where I was showing the place, the square. That was the place where the Jews of Rome were deported October 16th, 43, under the Nazi. But from Fossoli already, the wagons were going to Auschwitz already under the hands of the fascists. And this is the Fossoli Camp. And it's important to know that Italy has a concentration camp. And near the concentration camp of Fossoli, there is a deportee museum in Carpi. Carpi is a beautiful town, beautiful, also near Modena. And this is interesting. Why? Because this deportee museum was founded in the 60s. not many museums were founded in the 60s. So there were the people of the resistance in Italy who really wanted to create a museum to remember the Jews and all the deportees from Italy. When I guided a group from the IRA, from the International Holocaust Alliance, into this museum, people were extremely interested to see a museum, Holocaust museum, built in the early 60s in Italy. And here we are in Trieste, northeast of Italy. And this is a real, not only concentration camp, here there was a crematorium. That's the place where the crematorium was. So as you see, Italy has different places, different memorial sites, and the government of Italy is very committed in financing, committing, for example, in Fossoli now, they are creating a new visitor centers with the public money. The government is really committed to show what happened to the Jews, but it's also committed to show how much the Jews of Italy contributed to the Italian society, to the Italian history throughout 2,000 years of presence, with ups and downs, of course, but with a lot of dialogue between the two cultures. So I thank you very much. And of course, I'm glad to speak and to hear more from Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Simonetta. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to pass the mic now to Dr. Jeremy Maron.
Good day, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. And it's an honor to be here to mark this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you to Dr. Della Seta for your introductory remarks, and I'm looking forward to our conversation later today. As Dr. Manson indicated earlier in the introductions, my name is Jeremy Maron, and I am the curator of Holocaust and Genocide content at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which is in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And I am also going to share a PowerPoint presentation for my talk today. So for my remarks today, my brief introductory remarks, what I'm hoping to do is provide everyone who might be unfamiliar with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights with a brief introduction to the museum and to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights approach to representing the Holocaust, which I'm hoping will provide a little bit of a backdrop for my role in the conversation with Simonetta shortly. So to provide a little bit of context about the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, it's a national museum, a Canadian national museum, again, based in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, that opened in September 2014 to the public after a number of years in development, as Dr. Della Seta noted. With a number of the museums in development in Italy, sometimes this can be a significant process to develop a new museum. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights mandate is to explore the subject of human rights with special but not exclusive reference to Canada in order to enhance the public's understanding of human rights, to promote respect for others, and to encourage reflection and dialogue. So a very broad mandate. And again, the museum opened to the public in September 2014. But the Canadian Museum for Human Rights actually began earlier, or the idea of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights began in the early 2000s as a private sector initiative under a Winnipeg-based philanthropic and educational organization called the Asper Foundation. And in particular, the Asper Foundation's pedagogical program, the Human Rights and Holocaust Studies program. And this is a program that the Asper Foundation ran for high school students in Winnipeg, initially in Winnipeg, and then expanding beyond Canada. Began in 1997. It involved some classroom instruction on the Holocaust in particular, with a focus on the Holocaust and human rights more broadly, that culminated in a trip to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So again, this program began in 1997. And shortly thereafter, the head of the Asper Foundation, a noted business person and media owner named Israel Asper, began thinking that it was too bad that an organization like this, an initiative like this, had to send Canadian students to the United States to learn about the Holocaust and human rights. And it was this sort of desire that created an impetus for Israel Asper to begin lobbying for the creation of a Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where similar human rights education on the Holocaust and human rights, but from a Canadian perspective, could be undertaken for Canadian students. The project was adopted by the Canadian federal government in 2008. And that's when it became formally one of Canada's national museums and the first national museum to be established outside of Canada's national capital region of Ottawa. So from the very beginning, the idea was always that the Canadian Museum for Human Rights would, one of the lenses that it would take, not the only lens, but one of the lenses it would take to examine human rights and to educate visitors about human rights would be through the Holocaust, stemming in part from the Asper Foundation's Holocaust educational program. So the guiding question for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights as we were developing all of the galleries in general, but examining the Holocaust Gallery in particular was not should there be a Holocaust Gallery in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, but what is an appropriate manner for representing the Holocaust in a Canadian museum and a Canadian Museum for Human Rights with the human rights mandate. So in summary, I'm just going to do this quite briefly. And at the end, I'm going to give reference to a longer article that myself and my predecessor, the former curator of the Holocaust Gallery at the CMHR, that we published in 2018, that goes into much more detail about our approach to the Holocaust in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So I'll include that reference at the end. But for now, suffice to say, in summary, the approach that we've taken in the examining the Holocaust Gallery in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which I should note is not the only gallery that includes content on the Holocaust, but of course it's the gallery that is focused specifically on the Holocaust. And in this gallery, we aim to balance the particularity of the Holocaust and the universality of human rights without subsuming one to the other. So for my little introduction today, I'm going to go through a few of the exhibits in the gallery and how they aim to navigate this at times delicate balance in a number of different ways. So again, representing the Holocaust in a manner that is fitting for Canadian Museum for Human Rights with our mandate. So the first approach that I want to talk about is what I call a thematic approach. And this is the approach that is taken on, one could call it the main exhibit in the gallery. It's the three perimeter walls that form the border of the gallery. It's the largest and most, I guess, didactic exhibit with historical content in the gallery. And what this exhibit does is it looks at a number of themes that relate both to the particularity of the Holocaust and also encourage reflection in a more universal sense on the from a human rights perspective. So the three themes that are taken on the different walls are the abuse of state power, the persecution in particular of minority groups, and the theme of war and genocide. Now, I should note that in the gallery, the manifest content in this particular exhibit is focused on the Holocaust. So the link of these issues to broader human rights stories and other examples of these issues manifest in different contexts are left implicit for visitors to make these connections on their own. So if as a visitor is going through and examining on the persecution wall the demonization of the Jewish people by Nazi Germany, the use of propaganda to dehumanize them, visitors may very well be able to make that connection to, as for example, the dehumanization of the Tutsi in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, whereby the extremist Hutu media was referring to them as cockroaches, not dissimilar to how Jews were presented in Nazi propaganda as vermin or pests, and how that dehumanization sets a critical groundwork for the perpetration of genocide. Another aspect of the Holocaust Gallery and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is the importance of bringing the Holocaust conceptually close. The Holocaust has become, in a lot of ways, large because of its widespread awareness and broad representations, sometimes very popular representations, has become almost iconic of the brutal brutal actions that humanity is capable of. And sometimes when things become iconic, they can become sort of abstract. And this is a particular challenge in a locale like Canada that has a very different, and one could argue distanced, relationship to the Holocaust, unlike those countries that were directly touched by that, whose Jewish populations were directly impacted by the Nazi and their ally and their collaborators' policies. Dr. Della Seta's discussion about some of these museums and memorial sites in Italy where this history actually took place in a very tangible sense. So the importance of bringing the Holocaust conceptually close for visitors kind of assumes a greater challenge in a Canadian context. And one of the ways that we tried to navigate this challenge in the gallery was to have include a film that is centralized in the gallery that looks at anti-Semitism in Canada during the 1930s and 1940s. So if the walls in the gallery kind of around its perimeter are looking at the European historical situation, the film in the gallery is looking at the anti-Semitism that existed in Canada in the 1930s and the 1940s, in both the political realm and the social realm that informed things like Canada's restrictive anti-Semitic immigration policies, the refusal of entry to the St. Louis, and also the social anti-Semitism that existed in Canada that informed, or I guess that kind of informed the political anti-Semitism and the political restrictions that were in place at the time. And the goal of the film is not to equate or gloss over the distinctions between anti-Semitism as it manifested in Canada in the 1930s and as it manifested in a genocidal sense in Nazi-occupied Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, but to kind of disabuse visitors from thinking, oh, the Holocaust was a horrible thing that happened long ago and far away, to get them thinking about the sentiments behind the Holocaust. There were some of these sentiments, anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia, that were present in the Canadian body politic as well. Another way that we try to bring the Holocaust close for our visitors is highlighting the stories of Canadian survivors, including some of those from Winnipeg. And I've just included a couple of images here of two of the local survivors whose stories are included in the gallery, Carmela Finkel and Siggy Wasserman, both of whom unfortunately passed away within the last year or so. And I think hopefully Dr. Della Seta and I will be able to talk about the challenges that the looming post-survivor world is posing to Holocaust representation and Holocaust memorialization. And the reason that we wanted to include these stories of Canadian survivors was to show visitors that these stories are close, and these are individuals that are part of our national family. And these are people that you might know in your lives. And one example of this is we had a school group from Toronto who was going through the gallery along with a survivor, a very respected Holocaust educator from Toronto, Judy Weisenberg-Cohen, whose story is featured in the gallery, and she was with the group of students as well. So it was an object lesson in the propinquity of the Holocaust and its lessons for these students in Canada. The third of the four exhibits that I want to briefly touch on is an exhibit in the Holocaust Gallery that adopts a more explicitly comparative lens, a comparative genocide lens, by looking at the work of Raphael Lemkin, looking at the Holocaust through the lens of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish legal scholar who coined the term genocide in 1943, and then published his book Access Rule in Occupied Europe in 1944. And this exhibit is a digital exhibit that explores the Holocaust in 4 other mass atrocities that Lemkin viewed as genocides and used as he formulated the concept of genocide. And this exhibit looks at these 5 atrocities or 5 genocides through 3 genocidal methods that Lemkin identified as frequently used in attempts at group destruction: physical methods, biological methods, and cultural methods across the Holocaust, and 4 other mass atrocities that Lemkin viewed as genocides, including the Armenian genocide, which is on the image in the bottom right here, the Holodomor famine genocide in 1932-33 Ukraine, also the Spanish colonization of the Americas and the British colonization of Tasmania. For Lemkin, the idea about colonization and genocide were very, very closely linked. Lemkin wrote about other atrocities as genocides as well. This exhibit looks at these 5 to give kind of an overview, a comparative overview. Again, not to gloss over the differences, but to illuminate some of the similarities as well, while respecting the differences that each of these genocides had in different time and place. The last exhibit that I want to briefly talk about is one that's frequently used in our educational tour programs. One is an exhibit that provokes reflection on questions of agency and individual choice through juxtaposition. So this exhibit is a large display case that features a backdrop with aerial shots of the main camp at Auschwitz and also Auschwitz-Birkenau, juxtaposed with objects on display in front of the aerial shots that speak to some of the smaller, quote unquote, smaller actions required for the Holocaust to be perpetrated on the scale that it was. So I encourage visitors to think about how the blueprints for the crematoria had to be drafted, how order forms for Zyklon B gas had to be prepared, how transport lists, the logistics of transporting thousands and thousands of people between different camps, between ghettos and transport centers to extermination camps. These human rights atrocities on the scale of the Holocaust don't just happen, but are dependent on individuals' actions and choices. So we try to use this juxtaposition to encourage visitors to think about how their actions, even seeming small ones, might contribute to human rights in either positive or negative ways. This was just a brief overview of how the Holocaust is represented in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and some of the questions that informed the development of it. As I mentioned at the beginning, for a more detailed discussion of the development of the Holocaust Gallery, including some of the questions that we asked ourselves as we were developing, some of the times we had to hit the pause button, take a step back and reformulate some things. My predecessor and I published an article in Holocaust Studies, the journal Holocaust Studies in 2018. And if you would like a PDF, you can feel free to email me. I'd be happy to send you a PDF of the article. My email address is on the screen here. For now, I think I'll close my introductory remarks, and I look very forward to a conversation about some of these very important issues with Dr. Della Seta and Veronica as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you very much. Actually, I would like also to inform all the attendees they can send questions. I will read it out loud and submit it to our 2 speakers. And I would like to start with my first question. Usually it's always the first question that breaks the ice. Both of you are expert in museums. And of course, I would like to ask you what do you think the role of museums is today? Of course, is to preserve the memory and to preserve the history of Judaism and the 2,000 years of Judaism that Dr. Della Seta was referring to. But especially today in a contemporary world where we have seen, unfortunately, a rise in xenophobia, racism, and actually anti-Semitic actions, words, articles. And we've seen a number, I don't want to see an increasing number, but we have seen a number of people that even negate the Holocaust. Now the Holocaust has been invented, it never existed, and so forth. What in this context what is the role of the Museum of Ferrara or the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba, or the museum in general, in facing such an incredible and difficult challenge? And I pass the microphone, I would say, to who wants to answer first.
I'm ready for that if Dr. Maron is. Thank you, Director. I think, let me start with what I thought when Dr. Jeremy Maron was speaking. How different is the perspective and the perception of the Holocaust if you are in Europe and if you are outside Europe. Now, speaking about creating museums, right? I mean, our first goal here, the need was really to speak about the presence of the Jews, the contribution of the Jews, and what happened to the Jews on our territory, and then linking the Holocaust to the human rights narrative. Now, when you do it, it was extremely interesting to listen to you because actually you did the same, but also the other way around, and this, I don't think it would have been possible here, because you first have to face the atrocities, what happened and what happened under the Italians, what happened here, and you have to get accounts with history. You can't just tell history. You really have to do a lot of work and see what happened and who was guilty and who was to be blamed and who was. So this is it's a suffering path, not only for the Jews, actually from the others, but it has to be done before getting to human rights, and we will get there. I just want to tell you, not long ago, I think it was a year ago, Carrie Kennedy came and visited that was my museum at that point, and she visited it because of human rights, and she visited it and she was excited. At that point, we also had an exhibition by Danny Caravan on the connection between Holocaust and the human rights. However, I would have never started from that. I had to start from the Arch of Titus, and I had to start from the fact that is not very well known, by the way, that when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and brought the menorah, brought all the treasure from the temple into Rome, what did they do with that? The treasure of Jerusalem served the building of the Colosseum. So how many people visit the Colosseum every year without the pandemic? Usually millions. How many of them know that the Colosseum was built with the treasure of Jerusalem? And this is something that you might ask, what is the link between this and the Holocaust? The link is that the Jews were there, and the narrative of Judaism was in Rome since there, and the Holocaust and the anti-Jewish laws came as a terrible betrayal at something that was not supposed to happen. And it did not happen only under the Nazis, it also happened under the fascists. You know, here we're speaking in an institution, and yesterday I was connected with the office of the Prime Minister here. The other day we were connected with our parliament, and these things are finally said in the Italian parliament. So the narrative is a little bit different, but at the end of the day, the two things connect. So I'll stop here, but when you just, you know, I would just add one small thing. You ask what the museums are for. The museums are of course it depends, but the museums are important today. You know, in a time when we have our small device, we have our mobile all together in a time when you can get very easily to any kind of knowledge. The museum has a new role. The museum is an experience that you cannot have any place else. And I'm sure Dr. Jeremy Maron agrees with me. And in this case of the Holocaust, the museum is also the experience, the right experience, because we are fighting today, not so much the denial, but we're fighting a distortion of news, distortion of information. If you want to get the story, if you want to understand what happened, and especially now that survivors are unfortunately leaving us day after day, as you said, your 2 survivors passed here in Italy, most of them passed. We need museums. We need to go from memory to history. We need to give you the experience of history to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simonetta. Dr. Maron, would you like to, do you have your take on
yes,
the role of museums?
For sure, yeah.
In the face of a contradicting contemporary.
Your question and Dr. Della Seta's remarks give a lot of different strings to pull on. So I'll try to keep things in a kind of a logical manner. I think the role of museums generally is something that's kind of been being debated in the international museum community, in terms of the importance of museums as being holders of records and holders of history, and conserving and preserving the historical past, and also a move towards museums taking a more overtly activist role. And I believe it's the International Council of Museums that is actively trying to debate a new definition of museums, and the debate is taking a very long time because of this balance between objectivity and subjectivity. With our museum is kind of weird, as you noted, Dr. Della Seta. We kind of came to the Holocaust and human rights relation kind of in the reverse order, and I've in my interactions with a number of other Holocaust museums, they are moving towards human rights kind of in the same way. I'm thinking in particular the Illinois Holocaust Museum and the Holocaust Museum in Houston, both of whom I've had the chance to visit for artifact research. And in my conversations with them, they said that they're wrestling with trying to adhere to their mandate as Holocaust museums, but also expand into human rights in a very careful way as well, because they don't want to lose their focus also. Mm-hmm. With our museum having a very broad mandate, as I said, about provoking dialogue and reflection on human rights, our foundational aspect of our museum is kind of leading us towards that more overtly active role. So the preservation and conservation of history and of stories is still absolutely crucial, but it was a very deliberate decision for our museum to be called the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, rather than the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. Now, how, as a national museum, how the museum takes that stance towards being a museum for human rights is something that we're still working on, how that manifests in action. But I think one of, it's absolutely crucial that as one of our main reasons for being is to create this sort of behavioral and attitudinal change within our visitors. So as visitors are going through the museum, we want to provoke information, or we want to offer information, historically reliable and accurate information, absolutely. But we also want to provoke often uncomfortable introspection. So when visitors are looking at that juxtapositional case that I was talking about, when I'm speaking to students about this exhibit, the example that I give is, I absolutely love this film. I love Schindler's List. It was the first movie that got me into this area of study. But I give the students the example of the scene where Amon Girth, Ray Fiennes' character, is picking Jews off at the camp from his balcony with a rifle. And it's extremely easy to disassociate oneself from that action. I could never see myself doing something that monstrous. So historically accurate, yes, but an opportunity for interpersonal introspection, not so much. When you start thinking about someone whose job it was to type up transport lists or to make sure the trains were running on time, that's where some of those uncomfortable, it's not so easy to be like, oh, well, I would never do that, therefore this is a purely didactic informational gathering for me. It's to start thinking about, oh, wait a minute, hold on a second. These are more uncomfortable questions. What would I do? What is my role in my actions? How do my actions interact with others? Those kind of, that uncomfortable introspection, I think, is what can motivate museums to be catalysts for, again, behavior or attitudinal changes. How, and again, how that functions and how our museum carries that out, or how general museums can carry that out in general, I don't think it's something that will ever be fully resolved. It's a process that will be continually being worked on, but that seems to be the kind of the thrust that a lot of museum experts and museum professionals are moving towards.
Thank you so much, really. I have a few questions from the audience, and I would like, okay, Amy DiNardo is asking, I asked this to Dr. Della Seta, how many Holocaust survivors are still in Italy? I believe very few.
I'll answer the questions, but if you, with your permission, I will of course answer these questions. Unfortunately, not so many. We really have, on one hand today, 5, 6 camp survivors in our country, because the age, you know, and those who are still with us were children at that time. So already the testimonies are different than those who were really adults in the camps. But if you don't mind, Director, I would like to say a few more things on this narrative of Holocaust and human rights, because I think it's important these days, very important. I'm sure that Dr. Jeremy Maron is aware that sometimes we do have problems with associating human rights. I'll give you a very clear example. In Budapest, in Hungary, they are planning to open a human rights museum where the Holocaust is, you know, once you use the title human rights and you don't do what you, Dr. Maron, did, starting from the Holocaust that has a particular history and then getting to the human rights. But if you only give a title of human rights and you can tell whatever you want about the Holocaust and about, and specifically the Hungarian responsibilities on the Holocaust, which were quite terrible, even more than, you know, like in Italy, I was speaking about fascism, but also the Hungarians were allies with the Nazis. And what they did, we know what they did. They were completely involved with the deportation of the Jews. So, you know, all the experts today have to be very, very in alert of what is happening. Because as Elie Wiesel told us, you know, the remembrance can be stolen. Remembrance can be even ashamed, but we have a duty not to trivialize remembrance of the Holocaust, not to get it banal, and not to change the facts. You know, take a country like Poland today. Poland is stating, of course, again, they're not denying the Holocaust. They have Auschwitz, they have other camps inside Poland that they're saying this was done only by the Nazis. We had nothing to do with them. So I am absolutely in favor of connecting Holocaust with human rights, very much so, because knowing the Holocaust gives us the tools to read and to understand and to prevent other genocides and other bad things. However, we must study and know exactly what Holocaust is, and we cannot create a confusion around it and just have an excuse not to say the truth. So sorry, but I had to say this, and I'm sure that my colleague there agrees. You know, we both are on the same. We want to, and I agree completely when he says that you need to provoke. One of our challenges today is, how do we drag young people into this narrative? How do we shock them? Is it possible to shock young people today with Holocaust or not? So all the experts are working on these big questions: how to fight distortion, how to bring young people to the knowledge of the Holocaust, how to make the Holocaust, yes, a symbol, but not only a symbol, an historical event, something that happened, something that has made us different and has created suffering through generations, something that doesn't really matter only for the Jews, but matters for the humanity. Wherever you have discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, there the society is certainly sick. And we have to tell why. Sorry.
I don't know if my speakers can see the questions that are coming in, and there are quite a few. So at this point, I need to, can you see the questions on your screen? Okay, so I actually would start with Patrizia Villani, who's asking, and this is a question for Dr. Jeremy Maron. Do you think it will be a good initiative to increment the knowing about the Holocaust and the history around in Canadian schools? The Canadian students don't even know enough about the history outside of Canada. I leave that to Dr. And here we again, it's part of the purpose of the educational purpose of museums, I believe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, our educational team would be more knowledgeable about the extent to which Holocaust education is formally included in the curricula in the different school systems around Canada. In Canada, the school systems are provincially run. I know in many school regions, the Holocaust is included in various units in various different ways at different grade levels. And it's certainly a challenge. I know one of the things that we frequently, our responses that we are, the input that we get from teachers is that it's very hard sometimes to teach human rights in the classroom. So teachers very much appreciate the opportunity to come to the museum so their students can learn about human rights in a variety of different ways. Again, the Examining the Holocaust gallery is one of the galleries at the museum, but there are other galleries that speak to different human rights issues that might fit different units or different pedagogical focuses a bit better. Certainly the challenge about a lack of awareness of different human rights events outside of Canada is a challenge, but there's also the challenge of a lack of awareness about human rights abuses and situations within Canada with Canadian students, and particularly the genocide of Indigenous persons in Canada and the residential school system. And so there's certainly the amount of information about the human rights issues in Canada is certainly taught a lot more than it was when I was in elementary school and high school. The education my son is getting includes a lot more information about that, but there's still a lot of kind of a lack of awareness about what is happening within Canada. So it's sort of a balance. It's kind of the other side of the balance of the film that I was talking about on Canada, on anti-Semitism in Canada in the 1930s and 1940s. The perception of viewing the Holocaust as something that happened over there that didn't have a lot to do with Canada, other than Canada fighting on the side of the Allies to defeat Nazi Germany, which it did. there was also anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish fervor within Canada. At the same time, there has to be a willingness within the Canadian educational system and the Canadian political system and Canadian culture to face our own human rights stories, both the positive and the very negative as well. So I guess it's a balance. And one of the ways to kind of navigate that balance is to make sure that this education that you're doing either in the schools or at the museum is doing both, so that you're not, when I was talking about balancing the particularity of the Holocaust and the universality of human rights and not subsuming one to the other, you're not losing either the domestic situation or the international situation. And if you're focusing on one, you're not doing it so as to not focus on the other, right? So I think that's sort of that balance between knowing what's happening and the importance of knowing what's happened in your national context and how that relates to other contexts as well. Because these human rights issues, they all, there are so many layers of intersection. What you don't want the intersection to do is gloss over the particularities. And I think this is something that Dr. Della Seta was talking about in relation to the museum in Hungary. To use a universal trope like human rights as a means to evade some of the difficult questions that a position focused on particularities can reveal. I think you can do both well, but it's very easy to do both not well.
Right. There is a question, Maurizio Gualtieri. As other communities such as the Armenian community are collaborating together with the Jewish community in creating new projects, and I believe this is it's for both speakers. I mean, are other society, nations, ethnic groups that have been subject to discrimination, and well, the Armenian also, they've been subject to genocides, that's admitted, and like the Native Americans, same. Is there any collaboration also with these groups to raise awareness?
Absolutely, yes. In the case of Italy, absolutely, yes. And we also held different events with Armenians in the National Museum of Italian Judaism, since we believe that, again, the history of the Jews and is bringing a lot of sensitiveness vis-a-vis other discriminations. We had events with the Armenians, we had events with Sinti and Rom population, and we also, for example, when I was a director there, I hired a family of refugees from Africa into Italy to be the gardeners in our museum. I mean, knowing what happened to the Jews through the centuries. By the way, there is a question about do we speak about the expulsion from South Italy and or from Spain? Of course, yes, it's part of the story, but I mean, once you know the story, you know all the story, you are more able to relate to other things. And certainly, I think it's very important that a Jewish museum or a museum of the Holocaust relates and gets in partnership with other groups. Absolutely, it doesn't say that their history is exactly, our history, but it's certainly there is something in common, and there should be partnership. In Italy, yes, we do have.
Yeah, similarly in Canada, in the last couple of years, one of the projects that I was working on specifically was a film that we worked on in collaboration with the Rwandan Canadian community in light of the 25th anniversary of the 1994 genocide, and particularly the Rwandan community in Montreal. And in Montreal specifically, the atrocity affected communities, including the Jewish community, including the Rwandan community, Armenian community, and Cambodian community. They do a lot of initiatives together. And the Montreal Holocaust Museum, which was the first Holocaust museum created in Canada, is often a venue just because it has the physical space for these cross-cultural events. And when we launched the film that we developed in collaboration with the Rwandan community, we had a panel discussion that invited members from these other communities as well, the Armenian, Cambodian, and the Jewish community as well. So there is a lot of cross-community dialogue about this, and it feels very, it's just a very positive feeling to be part of that. And as Dr. Della Seta notes, these events do not aim to occlude distinctions between the different events themselves or the different experiences of the diasporic communities, or the generational or the transgenerational impacts of them. But it's sort of it's positive to have this kind of commonality of groups, and the bringing these groups together can sometimes reveal insights that hadn't really been thought of previously. So a couple of years ago, I think this was probably 2000 and maybe 2017, I want to say, I think it was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We had it was either for the January Holocaust Remembrance Day or for Genocide Awareness Month in April. We had an event where we brought a local Holocaust survivor, Dr. Stephen Carter, and a Rwandan survivor of the Tutsi genocide in for a discussion between the two of them. And one of the parts of Dr. Carter's story is how when he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, he had his nose intentionally broken to make it look like a less Jewish nose, quote unquote. And in the conversation with the survivor of the Tutsi genocide, the survivor was talking about how the pseudoscience of physiognomy and measurement of different facial features was a critical component for identifying Tutsi or distinguishing them from Hutu during the Tutsi genocide. So this was sort of an unexpected commonality between Dr. Carter and the survivor of the Tutsi genocide that bringing these communities together can speak to. We've at the Museum for Human Rights, we've also brought together individuals who have experience with the Indian residential school system in Canada and Holocaust survivors as well to speak about the very different cases of attempted group eradication, but have commonalities as well. So yeah, for sure, similarly, as Dr. Della Seta said, in Italy, there are initiatives like that happening in Canada too, in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, also I wanted to mention last year at the Memorial de la Shoah in Paris was a very interesting exhibition on what happened in Rwanda. And it was very important to see people coming and students coming to learn about the Holocaust, also learning about the Rwanda genocide. But again, both of the genocides were very well described, and there were voices of survivors of both. So the thing is, yes, we can associate things, but it's very crucial to learn about things as they were in Rwanda, and to learn. This is the role of museums.
Thank you so much. I have one last question. I think we can wrap up this conversation around it, and because a person from the audience is asking, can you please forward the email address? I imagine it means the website addresses of the museums that Dr. Della Seta mentioned during her presentation. So if you agree, I would like to finish this conversation with the last slide of Dr. Della Seta. If you can please repost all the websites of the Italian Holocaust and Judaism museums. I really would like to thank, there you are. So this was to respond Melvin Rosenfeld, please feel free to copy that slide. And if necessary, we can, of course, please email or contact the Italian Cultural Institute, and we can also forward it by email. I really would like to thank you. And I would like also to as a conclusion, we talked about January 27th as a very topic, symbolic, important date, but today is January 26th. So some people may wonder why this conversation is taking place today, and this is because Dr. Simonetta Della Seta tomorrow has very important engagements during the whole day of during the whole Holocaust Remembrance Day. So I do thank you, and I do thank also Simonetta for being here today. I do thank also Dr. Jeremy Maron for accepting to be in this conversation on January 26th, even though we are celebrating a day before, il Giorno della Memoria, or our Italian Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to you, and thank you to the audience. It's very important.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.